Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. Welcome, welcome to Boston, and welcome to Boston's Freedom Trail. Our new State House was erected in 1797. Cornerstone laid by Paul Revere and our governor at the time, Samuel Adams. We're looking up at the gold dome that is gold, 23-karat gilded gold. When the dome was first erected, it was made of shingles or wood, and it did leak. They commissioned Paul Revere's company to line it with copper. They did in 1802. The 1870s, they put on that gilded gold. It's been that way ever since. The first all black from the North to fight in the Civil War. Keep in mind it was illegal. The movie Glory,
yes, okay,
depicted by Matthew Broderick, would play Robert Gould Shaw. When the blacks could join the service after the Emancipation Proclamation came down, they could enlist. Before that, it was certainly illegal. But they could enlist, but they could not serve as officers. The officers had to be white. Robert Gould Shaw came from a prominent family here in Boston on Beacon Hill. He agreed to lead the 54th. The blacks fought without pay until they got the same rate as their white counterpart. Robert Gould Shaw also fought without pay, most of them losing their lives at the attack at Fort Wagner, South Carolina, along with Robert Gould Shaw as well. The various types of tombs that are here, the slate uprights, the tabletops, but for now we'll concentrate on the final resting places of some of the patriots. All of the stones are originals except for the patriots. Those are more like 20th century tombs. The originals either stolen or misplaced many years ago. But we're looking up at the tomb of Franklin. That's Ben Franklin's parents. Mother and father, brothers and sisters of the Franklin family. Ben Franklin, born here in Boston in 1706, left as a young man to go to Philadelphia and spending many years, as we know, in France and in England. Ben Franklin is buried in Philadelphia. Final resting place of the man the Bostonians then called the Patriot. James Otis, Harvard educated, an attorney representing all the merchants in Boston, arguing all of the cases coming over from England, coining the phrase, taxation without representation is tyranny. I would argue every day the Stamp Act, also arguing vehemently, and then the next day be known to walk around town saying things like, "Oh, I hope the king doesn't think of me in disfavor. I only mean that if you're going to make a law, make it so that we can enforce it." Here we are at the final resting place of the richest man in Boston, Jon Hancock. We came from the new State House with that gold dome. Before that was built, that would be the property of Jon Hancock. Had the largest house in town, and also Jon Hancock would ride around town in a gilded carriage, velvet clothing, feathers in his cap. People would shout, "There goes King Hancock." Didn't seem to mind. He relished in all the attention. Being the richest man in Boston, making his money the old-fashioned way. He inherited it. Uncle Thomas. Jon Hancock, when people ask for a signature, they'll say, "Put your Jon Hancock on the line." It's because he was the first signer of the Declaration of Independence, with the largest signature on that declaration. And when he was asked why he signed it that way, he responded, "I want to make sure that fat King George can read it in London without his spectacles." Final resting place of Apollos Revere Jr. Apollos Revere. Paul Revere. Paul Revere, this is a 20th century tomb. However, right next to me, there's an original footstone. Paul Revere became a wealthy man. He had a headstone and a footstone. Paul Revere, a good patriot, but not necessarily famous in his lifetime. Paul Revere is only famous because of a poem written 87 years after that ride. "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." Gives you the impression he was the only rider that night. Not true, there were many riders. "One if by land, two if by sea, on the opposite shore will I be." Not exactly. Paul Revere was on this side of the river when the lanterns were hung. It says in the poem that he made it to Concord town. Not exactly. I'm not here to bash Paul Revere, but we know that Longfellow took liberties with history. We know the Revolutionary War began April 19th, 1775, Lexington and Concord. The evening before that, the evening of the ride, keep in mind that we had spies, we being the Patriots, they had spies, they being the British soldiers. One of our spies, we believe, was Mrs. Gage, an American-born woman married to Thomas Gage, General Thomas Gage of the British Army. Mrs. Gage caught word that the British soldiers were getting on their ships, sailing out of Boston. Right beyond Boston Common is where the public garden is. That was the bay. That's where they were getting on their ships to sail over to Cambridge to begin a 16-mile march out to Lexington and Concord. The British soldiers, their mission was to get to Lexington and Concord to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock, who were there hiding at the home of Jonas Clark. The British soldiers were then going to leave Lexington and go to Concord to get the ammunition they knew the Patriots were storing. Mrs. Gage called upon her friend, the leader of the Sons of Liberty, a Harvard-educated medical man by the name of Dr. Joseph Warren. Joseph Warren then called upon the first rider that night, a fellow by the name of William Dawes. Had William Dawes go out by the neck, the only exit by land. Get out to Cambridge, Roxbury, get out to Lexington to give the alarm. Joseph Warren then called upon Paul Revere to go by the way of Charlestown and get out through Medford and go to Lexington. Before Paul Revere left, Paul Revere told a young man working at the Old North Church, hang 2 lanterns, because they're going out the shorter way. Hang 2 lanterns. That fellow's name was Robert Newman. So it wasn't a signal to Paul Revere, in a sense it was from Paul Revere. That signal went over to Charlestown across the Charles River, to the militia, so that they would send out their own riders in case the riders didn't get through. 100 years after the Revolutionary War, President Grant was there. Daniel Chester French unveiled a statue, the Minuteman Statue. Ralph Waldo Emerson had a hymn, by the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. You've heard of that, the shot heard round the world. Question is, why wasn't that dedicated in Lexington? Certainly that same morning, the shots rang out in Lexington first. 8 Minutemen lay dead and 10 wounded. Well, we know in Lexington the command was never given. But in Concord, Major John Buttrick, now telling his farmers, Minutemen, to fire back at the world's largest army, the English army, to fire back at them. Early on in Lexington, Captain John Parker said, if they mean to have a battle, let it begin here. Back in Concord later on that same morning, John Buttrick, fire back, fellow soldiers, fire back. Are you going to let them burn our town? Fire back! For God's sakes, fire back! And fire back they did. 3 British soldiers were killed and 2 were wounded at the, 2 Minutemen were at the North Bridge. More importantly, before the day was over, 275 British casualties, either killed or wounded.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this visit here in Boston, Mass. We were in Concord, Lexington, and Cambridge. It's been so exciting. And you know, it was a little chilly, but it was wonderful. I really loved the reenactment. It was so exciting to see all the powwow and the guns and the costumes and everyone just coming out and celebrating. It really is a celebration of life. Until next week, I'm Jon Haggins, the GlobeTrotter.